The first truck backed up to the fence line at 6 in the morning, and by 6:15 it had dumped 11 tons of fresh sawdust in a mountain taller than Faye Renner's own hay barn. "She's letting them dump mill waste right there in the pasture," Dale Hutto said, standing at his own fence 2 properties down, watching a second truck line up behind the first. "Whole road's going to smell like a lumberyard by August. I don't know what that woman's thinking." The mill needed it gone. Faye needed a way forward. Neither of them knew, that first morning, what would happen next. The county road she lived on ran 11 farms deep, most of them family operations 2 or 3 generations old, held together by the same rhythms of hay and dairy and row crop that had defined that stretch of country since before any of the current owners were born, a rhythm few of them had ever seriously questioned, because questioning it had rarely, in living memory, paid off for anyone bold enough to try. Faye Renner was 64 years old that spring. Small and wiry, in the particular way of a woman who had spent 5 decades doing physical farm work and had never once let her body soften into anything else, her hair gone iron gray and kept short and practical under a canvas hat, hands scarred and sure from a lifetime of the same chores repeated season after season. She had run 22 acres of hay and a small dwindling dairy herd since her husband died 11 years earlier, ground that had grown steadily less profitable every year as feed costs climbed and milk prices stayed flat, and she had spent the 2 winters before that first truckload arrived doing the kind of arithmetic that keeps a person awake at night, watching her savings thin against a farm that no longer covered its own costs. What none of her neighbors knew that morning, watching truck after truck unload what looked to them like nothing but a nuisance and a smell, was what Faye had learned as a girl of 9, standing in her own grandmother's root cellar with a kerosene lamp, watching Nadine Pruitt coax oyster mushrooms out of nothing but sawdust, spent coffee grounds, and a patience the rest of the family had always considered slightly strange. Faye's grandmother had grown mushrooms in that cellar every winter of Faye's childhood, not as any kind of business, just as a quiet household habit passed down from her own mother before the Depression had taught a whole generation of women exactly how much food a person could coax out of material everybody else considered garbage. Nadine had shown Faye how to layer hardwood sawdust with mushroom spawn in shallow trays, how to keep the cellar's humidity high and its light low, how to recognize, by smell alone, when a batch had colonized properly and when something had gone wrong with it. "Rot isn't ruin," Nadine used to say, checking a tray by lamplight. "It's just the next ingredient, if you're patient enough to let it finish becoming something." Nadine Pruitt had raised 6 children through the Depression on ground that gave up little else, and she had never once, in Faye's memory, treated the cellar mushrooms as anything special or strange, only as one more quiet, patient chore among the dozen others that kept a household fed. She died when Faye was 19, married, and already 3 years into the dairy life that would occupy the next 4 decades of her own working years, and Faye had let the cellar knowledge go dormant the way a person lets any childhood skill go dormant when the adult world hands them a different, more urgent set of chores to master instead. She kept, tucked into an old recipe box she inherited from her mother, 3 index cards in her grandmother's careful hand describing spawn ratios and moisture levels for oyster mushrooms grown on sawdust, cards Faye had read perhaps twice in 40 years before that spring and had never once expected to need again. Faye had been 9 years old the first time she heard that sentence and hadn't understood a word of what it meant. She understood it fully at 64, sitting at her kitchen table with a stack of unpaid feed bills and a phone call from the county's largest sawmill still ringing in her ears, a foreman named Curtis Mabry explaining, almost apologetically, that the mill was drowning in sawdust its usual buyers no longer wanted, paying steep tipping fees to haul it to the landfill, and would any local farmer be willing to take it off their hands for free, no charge at all, just to make the problem disappear. Every other farmer on that road turned the offer down within a day of hearing about it, unwilling to let their pastures fill up with what looked, to a conventional eye, like nothing but a mess with no obvious use. Faye said yes before she'd fully worked out what she intended to do with it, because something in the offer had reached back through 55 years and touched the memory of a kerosene lamp and a root cellar and a grandmother who had never once, in Faye's whole childhood, called anything a waste product until she'd exhausted every possible use for it first. She drove to the mill herself that same week to meet Curtis Mabry in person, a heavyset, tired-eyed man in his 50s who seemed genuinely relieved that anyone, wanted the material instead of merely tolerating its disposal. "We're producing 40 tons a month easy," Curtis told her, walking her through a sawdust pile the size of a small barn. "Used to sell it to a particle board plant 2 states over, but they closed down last year. Landfill's charging us by the ton now to take it, and it's eating our margins alive. You want it, it's yours, free, delivered, for as long as you can use it." "I can use all of it," Faye said, though she had, at that point, only the barest outline of a plan, built more on a childhood memory than on any real business calculation. She drove home that afternoon and pulled the old recipe box down from the top kitchen shelf, where it had sat mostly untouched for a decade, finding her grandmother's 3 index cards exactly where she remembered them, the pencil gone soft and faded, but still legible. Notes on spawn ratios and moisture percentages written in a hand Faye recognized before she'd even fully read a word of it. She spent that whole evening at the kitchen tablecloth referencing those cards against modern mushroom cultivation guides she found at the county library the following morning, discovering, with a mixture of relief and quiet astonishment, that her grandmother's Depression-era instincts matched the current science almost exactly, off by only small refinements in temperature control and sterile technique that 80 years of formal study had added to what Nadine had learned entirely by trial in a cold cellar with no thermometer at all. "Least I finally understand why you kept badgering me to grow mushrooms in that cellar," Faye said out loud to an empty kitchen that night, the way a person sometimes talks to someone long gone when a memory finally clicks into place decades late, and laughed a little at herself for it, and did not feel foolish doing it. At the feed store that same month, where the road's farmers gathered most Saturdays to weigh in on anything worth talking about, Faye's sawdust deliveries became a running topic of gentle, then sharper, ridicule, the particular mockery reserved for a widow doing something nobody could quite explain. "She's turning her hay ground into a lumber yard," Dale Hutto said, leaning on the counter. "I don't know what she's planning to grow in sawdust, but it isn't hay, and hay's the only thing that Pasture's ever paid for." Ruth Camby, who ran the feed store counter and had known Faye 30 years, offered the gentlest version anybody managed. "I trust Faye's judgment more than most people on this road," Ruth said, sliding a receipt across the counter. "I just don't know that judgment and a mountain of sawdust are the same thing. I hope she knows something the rest of us don't." None of it changed what Faye did each week, which was clear a section of her old dairy barn's unused east wing, scrub it down, and begin building, board by board with lumber she salvaged from a collapsed hog shed 2 farms over, a series of low, shaded growing rooms insulated against temperature swings and fitted with the kind of humidity control her grandmother had achieved with nothing more. Then a damp cellar floor and a covered window. Her late husband, Walt Renner, had died of a heart attack in that same dairy barn 11 years earlier, checking a milking line at 5 in the morning the way he'd checked it every morning for 30 years, and Faye had kept the operation running afterward less because she loved dairy farming for its own sake, and more because it was the only life she'd known how to run alone. A decade of stubborn continuation that had, by the time the sawdust trucks arrived, worn her down to a kind of tired persistence rather than any real conviction. Clearing out the east wing of that same barn to build her first growing room had felt, she admitted to no one but herself, like the first decision she'd made in 11 years that wasn't simply an echo of what Walt would have done in her place, and something about that particular kind of freedom had frightened her almost as much as it had steadied her. She ordered her first batch of mushroom spawn that same spring, oyster and shiitake varieties chosen specifically because both grew reliably on hardwood sawdust substrate and commanded, she'd learned reading every extension bulletin and small farm mushroom guide she could find, prices at farmers markets and restaurant sales that made a pound of specialty mushroom worth many times what a pound of hay ever had. She spent $1,200 that first year on spawn, growing bags, and a secondhand steam sterilizer she found through a restaurant supply auction 2 counties over, the smallest capital outlay of any real venture she'd attempted in a decade, financed entirely out of what little savings her failing dairy operation had left her. The process itself, she relearned by trial that first spring, was less forgiving than her childhood memory of her grandmother's easy cellar competence had led her to expect. Sawdust substrate had to be pasteurized first, heated to kill competing fungi and bacteria without cooking the wood fiber into something too sterile to support the mushroom mycelium she was trying to establish. A balance she ruined twice before she found the right temperature and hold time on her second-hand sterilizer. Spawn had to be mixed through the cooled substrate at exactly the right moisture content. Too dry, and the mycelium would never establish. Too wet, and the whole block would rot into something closer to mush than mushroom. Colonization, the slow process of white mycelium threading its way through every corner of a growing bag, took 6 to 10 weeks depending on the variety and the season's ambient temperature. A stretch of patient waiting, during which nothing visible happened at all except a farmer checking bags daily for the telltale white fuzz that meant the process was working, or the telltale green or black bloom that meant it had failed. She learned to read the growing bags the way her grandmother must have once read a cellar tray by lamplight, checking each one daily for the particular clean white thread of healthy mycelium spreading through the substrate, a texture and smell she came to recognize almost instinctively within a few weeks. The same way she'd once learned to recognize a healthy udder or a sick calf by nothing more than sight and smell and long practiced attention. She kept a ledger in a spiral notebook, inoculation dates against colonization progress against eventual yield per bag, the kind of careful record keeping her years running a dairy operation had trained into her without her ever thinking of it as a transferable skill until she found herself applying it, almost without deciding to an entirely different kind of farming. "You're 12 weeks into growing something you can't even show me yet," her son Danny Renner said on the phone that spring, calling from 3 states away where he'd moved for work a decade earlier, worry threading through his voice, the way it always did when he called and found his mother deep into some new undertaking he didn't fully understand. "I don't want you sinking what's left of your savings into a hobby, Mama." "It's not a hobby," Faye said. "It's the same thing your great-grandmother did in a root cellar for 40 years. I'm just doing it at a scale that might actually pay a bill or two." Danny didn't have an answer for that and let her keep working, though the worry in his voice didn't fully leave it, not that spring and not for a long while after. Because a son, 3 states away, watching his mother pour herself into an unproven venture carries its own particular helplessness that distance only sharpens. If you've ever built something out of material everyone around you considered garbage, you know the particular quiet a person carries through a season like that. Not confidence, exactly. More a decision to keep tending something invisible and trust that the visible proof would eventually arrive on its own schedule. The first real harvest came that June. Oyster mushrooms fruiting out of the growing bags in dense, fan-shaped clusters that filled the converted barn wing with a smell nothing like the sawdust it had grown from, earthy and faintly sweet. And Faye sold her first 18 pounds at the farmer's market that same weekend, priced at $8 a pound, $144 that felt, after a decade of a dairy operation losing money every single month, like the first real proof in years that a different kind of farming might actually work on that ground. Her first farmer's market table was a folding card table borrowed from her own kitchen, a hand-lettered sign reading Renner Farm Mushrooms in paint she'd mixed from a leftover barn trim can, and she stood behind it that first Saturday with a mixture of pride and nerves she hadn't felt at a market stall since she was a young woman selling extra dairy calves decades earlier. Most passers-by that first morning walked past without much curiosity, mushrooms being an unfamiliar item at a market more accustomed to tomatoes and sweet corn, but a handful stopped, drawn by the smell alone, and one woman, an older regular named Vonda Castello, bought a full pound on the spot, simply because, she said. She hadn't smelled anything that fresh and earthy since her own mother used to forage chanterelles in the woods behind their childhood farm. "You're going to sell out of these before the market's even a season old," Vonda told her, and she was right, though it took most of that first summer to prove it. Word moved slowly at first, the way any real change moves through a road more accustomed to the same 3 crops, grown the same 3 ways for 3 generations. But by the end of that first summer, Faye had a standing order with 2 restaurants in the county seat, chefs who had grown tired of shipping specialty mushrooms in from out of state and were glad to find fresh, local product instead. and her weekly harvest had grown from 18 pounds to nearly 60, 180 tons of what had once been the mill's most expensive disposal problem now converted, batch by careful, patient batch, into something restaurants across the county seat were actively competing to buy from her instead of shipping in from somewhere else entirely. The setback came in her second season, and it arrived from exactly the direction her grandmother's old cellar wisdom had warned her about most clearly, though Faye had let herself grow, by then a little too confident in her own quickening pace. She had scaled up that second spring, doubling her growing capacity by converting a second section of the old dairy barn, working faster than her sterilizer's capacity comfortably allowed in order to keep pace with restaurant demand that had outgrown her original setup within months. A batch of substrate rushed through pasteurization on a day she was short on time and running 2 other tasks at once, came out undertreated, and within a week the contamination showed itself the way contamination always did. A fast-spreading bloom of aggressive green mold that outcompeted the mushroom mycelium entirely, spreading from bag to bag through the shared humid air of the growing room faster than she could isolate and remove the infected blocks. She lost nearly the whole second season expansion, 60 growing bags representing 3 months of work and nearly $900 in spawn and substrate costs, a loss that gutted not just her production for that stretch, but her restaurant contracts too. Both chefs politely but firmly filling their orders elsewhere for several weeks while she scrambled to rebuild clean stock. Danny drove down from 3 states away the weekend he heard about the contamination, taking 2 days off work he could barely spare, and found his mother in the barn's east wing sorting through ruined bags with a kind of grim, silent focus that worried him more than tears would have. "I keep thinking about Daddy's heart attack in this same barn," he told her, helping her haul the ruined blocks out to the burn pile. "You working yourself into the ground over mushrooms feels like a different version of the same thing I watched happen to him." "It's not the same thing," Faye said, not stopping the work. "He never once let himself slow down when something went wrong. I intend to." Danny didn't fully believe her that weekend, watching her work through exhaustion the same way she always had, but he noticed, driving back out of state 2 days later, that she'd spent that Sunday evening not pushing forward into a rushed rebuild, but sitting quietly at the kitchen table with her extension bulletins spread out in front of her, reading rather than doing. And it was that image, more than anything she'd said to him, that eventually eased some of his worry. She sat in the barn's east wing that evening, surrounded by bags gone black-green with mold, the smell sour and wrong where it had once been earthy and clean, and let herself think the things she had not let herself think in a full season of building something out of nothing. "Rot isn't ruin," her grandmother used to say. That night, surrounded by 60 bags of exactly the kind of rot that was, unmistakably, ruin, the sentence felt less like wisdom and more like a comfort she'd told herself too eagerly, without fully reckoning with how easily the same biological process that made mushroom cultivation possible could, with one rushed shortcut, undo 3 seasons of careful work in a single week. She thought about Danny's worry on the phone, about her own dwindling savings, about a road full of neighbors who would take this contamination as final proof of what they'd suspected from the first truckload, and wondered whether she had simply mistaken a childhood memory for a real business, romanticizing her grandmother's small household habit into something it had never been built to become. At this scale. She did not sleep that night. Somewhere close to 2 a.m, going back through the extension bulletins she'd collected that first year, she found the passage she'd skimmed past too quickly the first time. A detailed explanation of exactly why pasteurization time and temperature mattered as much as the numbers themselves, and why rushing the process under time pressure was. Of every mistake a small-scale grower could make, the single most common cause of a total contamination loss. She understood, reading it slow at 2 a.m. with 60 ruined bags cooling in the barn outside, that she hadn't failed because the whole idea was flawed. She'd failed because she'd let restaurant demand push her past the patient. Careful pace her grandmother's method had always actually required. She rebuilt that summer at half her previous speed, refusing every order that would have required cutting the pasteurization process short again, investing $400 she could barely spare in a proper digital thermometer and timer system for the sterilizer, so the process no longer depended on her own tired judgment at the end of a long day. She lost one of her 2 restaurant contracts permanently that summer, the chef unwilling to wait out her slower, more careful rebuild. But the one that stayed, a young chef named Priya Anand, who ran a small farm-to-table restaurant in the county seat, told her plainly why she was willing to wait. "Anybody can grow fast when everything goes right," Priya said. Picking up a restocked order that August, "I want to buy from the grower who slows down the second something goes wrong instead of cutting a corner to keep the numbers up. That's rarer than good mushrooms, if you want the truth of it." She rebuilt her sterilization protocol from the ground up that summer, timing every pasteurization cycle against the new digital thermometer rather than her own tired judgment, holding each batch at a consistent temperature for a full, unhurried duration, even when a restaurant order was pressing against her calendar. And she found, doing it that carefully, that her contamination rate over the following 2 years dropped to almost nothing, a handful of isolated bags caught and removed early, rather than a whole room lost overnight. She began, too, keeping a second notebook alongside her yield ledger, a running log of every mistake and near mistake, however small, because she had learned the hard way that the lesson a failure taught only stayed taught if she wrote it down before the memory of the failure itself faded into something less urgent than it had felt at 2 a.m. By that 3rd year, Faye's operation had grown past what her converted barn wing alone could handle, and she leased a second, larger structure from a neighbor 2 farms down, who was glad for the rental income on an unused equipment shed, expanding her weekly harvest past 130 pounds across both oyster and shiitake varieties. Plus a smaller experimental batch of lion's mane that had, within weeks of its first harvest, become the single most requested item on Priya's restaurant menu. What would you have done, watching a road full of conventional operations struggle while your own sawdust-built venture kept growing steadily underneath a barn roof nobody else had thought to look inside? The real proof came that 4th year, during a stretch that hit the rest of the road harder than any single season in a decade, a summer drought that scorched hay yields county-wide just as dairy prices, already thin, collapsed further under a national oversupply that squeezed every conventional dairy operation on that road toward the same grim arithmetic Faye herself had been doing at her kitchen table 4 years earlier. Dale Hutto's own hay operation, 60 acres he'd farmed conventionally his whole life, came in that drought year at less than half its normal yield, forcing him to buy supplemental feed at prices that ate through what little margin his cattle operation usually carried. The same slow financial bleed Faye had lived through for a decade before the sawdust trucks first arrived. He came to Faye's fence line that August, not to mock this time, but because word had reached him, the way real numbers eventually reach everyone on a road like that one, that her indoor growing operation, insulated from weather entirely, climate-controlled and independent of rainfall or soil moisture, or any of the conditions currently devastating every conventional acre on that road, had not merely survived the drought, but grown straight through it without missing a single week of harvest. "I've been hauling feed I can't afford for 2 months, Dale admitted, standing at the fence in his work boots, none of his old certainty left in his voice. "My hay's not worth what it cost me to bale it this year. I heard your mushroom operation didn't even notice the drought happened." "It didn't," Faye said. "That's the whole reason I built it indoors, off sawdust instead of soil. Weather can't touch what doesn't depend on rain. I called this a lumberyard 4 years ago," Dale said. "I've been thinking about that a lot this summer, watching my own ground fail while yours kept producing right through it." "You don't owe me an apology, Dale," Faye said. "You owe yourself a serious look at what this drought actually proved, though, if you're willing to take it." She showed him, that same week, what she did with her spent substrate once a batch had finished fruiting, and the mycelium-exhausted sawdust had nothing left to give a mushroom crop, not waste even then, but composted down over a season into a rich, fungally active soil amendment that Faye had been quietly using on her own remaining hay acreage for 2 years, watching those particular acres outperform the rest of her property in exactly the drought-stressed conditions that were currently crushing Dale's whole operation. Because soil built up with fungal compost held moisture and nutrients in ways depleted conventional ground simply couldn't match. She explained the composting process to Dale that same afternoon at the fence, the way her grandmother had once explained the mushroom cellar to a 9-year-old, unhurried and precise. Spent mushroom substrate, once a block had finished fruiting 2 or 3 flushes, still carried enormous biological value even though the mycelium's fruiting energy had been spent. A dense, partially decomposed organic matter rich in the same fungal networks that helped soil hold water and cycle nutrients far more efficiently than raw compost ever could on its own. She turned her spent blocks into open windrows behind the barn, letting them finish breaking down over 4 to 6 months, turning the piles every few weeks the way any composting operation required. Until what had once been sawdust, then mushroom substrate, became a dark, crumbling soil amendment that smelled of nothing but healthy earth. 3 transformations out of the same ton of sawdust, Faye told Dale. Mill's waste problem, then a mushroom crop, then better ground under whatever gets planted after. That's not luck. That's just refusing to call something finished before it's actually finished. Dale took 2 truckloads of spent substrate that fall, skeptical but out of better options, and spread it across 10 acres of his most depleted hay ground. And by the following spring, those 10 acres were, by his own admission at the feed store, the best producing ground on his whole farm, holding moisture through a dry stretch in May that had left the rest of his acreage cracked and struggling. I don't know what to call what you're running out there anymore, and I've been farming this road my whole life, Dale told her that spring, watching a fresh delivery of sawdust arrive at Faye's fence line, the same trucks that had once drawn his ridicule and his neighbors, now simply part of the road's ordinary rhythm, hardly worth a second glance from anyone driving past that stretch of fence. Anymore. It's not a mushroom farm. It's not a dairy. I don't know what box it fits in. It doesn't need a box, Faye said. It just needs to keep working. Priya Anand's restaurant hosted a small tasting event that same autumn, inviting a handful of regional food writers to sample dishes built around Faye's mushrooms alongside produce from 3 other local growers, and it was there, standing awkwardly at the edge of a dining room full of city people in a way that made her feel more like her grandmother's era than her own, that Faye watched a food writer taste a plate of seared lion's mane and describe it, in words Faye wrote down afterward because she liked them too much to trust her memory alone, as tasting like the ocean had learned to grow on land. The write-up ran the following month in a regional magazine, naming Renner Farm specifically, and the modest wave of new interest it generated pushed Faye's operation past what her 2 existing structures could comfortably supply for the first time. By her 5th year, Faye's operation had grown into the most consistently profitable piece of farming on that entire road, weathering 2 drought years and a dairy price collapse that had pushed 3 conventional operations nearby into selling out entirely, her weekly harvest steady across every season, because it answered to nothing but a controlled indoor climate and her own careful, unhurried attention. She had retired her last few dairy cows the year Dale first apologized, converting the last of her old pasture into a proper mushroom growing complex, and she had started, that same year, teaching a short seasonal course through the county extension office for any farmer curious enough to ask how a mountain of mill waste had become the only operation on the road that a drought couldn't touch. She hired her first part-time employee that same year, a young woman named Aisha Doswell, who'd grown up on a small vegetable operation 2 counties over and had answered Faye's handwritten sign at the feed store more out of curiosity than any real expectation the job would teach her much. Faye taught her the way her own grandmother had once taught a 9-year-old in a cellar, unhurried, letting Aisha make her own small mistakes on low-stakes batches before trusting her with anything that mattered to a restaurant order, and by the following spring Aisha was running the sterilization protocol almost entirely on her own. The digital thermometer log she kept every bit as careful as the one Faye herself had built out of her own hard-earned contamination lesson 3 years earlier. You could franchise this, Aisha told her once, half-joking, watching a fresh delivery of sawdust get unloaded at the fence. Teach 3 other farms how to do exactly what you did. I might, Faye said, not for the money, because there's 40 tons of this stuff leaving that mill every month, and it's a waste, in the truest sense of that word. If only one farm on this whole road ever bothers to ask what it could become. My grandmother didn't keep this knowledge to herself on purpose. Nobody around her ever asked. That's a different kind of waste than the sawdust ever was, and it's the one I'd rather spend the rest of my working years correcting. Curtis Mabry still delivered her sawdust personally most months. The mill's disposal problem long since become, in his own words, the easiest relationship the mill had with any local farmer. No tipping fees, no landfill hauling. Just a standing order that made both operations quietly better off than either had been the year they'd first met. Faye was 68 that spring. 5 years past the morning, the first truck dumped 11 tons of sawdust onto a pasture nobody thought had any use left in it, and she still checked her growing rooms every morning the way her grandmother had once checked a root cellar by lamplight, patient and unhurried, trusting the slow, invisible work happening inside every bag long before any proof of it showed itself on the surface. She kept her grandmother's 3 index cards, brittle now beyond safe handling, in a small frame on the wall of the original East Wing growing room, beside a photograph Danny had finally sent her the year he stopped worrying and started, instead, telling people at his own job 3 states away about his mother's mushroom farm with something closer to pride than concern. She stood in front of that frame some mornings before starting the day's checks, the same way another woman might pause at a photograph before leaving the house, thinking about a 9-year-old in a cold cellar who had no way of knowing, watching her grandmother work by lamplight, that she was being handed the one skill that would eventually outlast every other kind of farming her family had ever tried on that ground. Rot isn't ruin, she thought that spring, standing in a growing room dense with the clean, earthy smell of oyster mushrooms fruiting in careful rows. It's just the next ingredient. The thought carried none of the doubt it had carried the night she'd sat surrounded by 60 bags of genuine ruin, wondering if she'd mistaken a childhood memory for a real business. It felt, finally, like the plain fact her grandmother had always meant it to be, proven not by luck but by 5 years of patient correction every time the process demanded it. She thought, too, some mornings about the difference between the woman who had said yes to that first phone call from Curtis Mabry and the woman standing in the growing room 5 years later, and understood that the difference wasn't really about mushrooms at all. It was about a decade of running a dairy operation out of stubborn continuation rather than real conviction, and the particular relief of finally building something out of her own choosing instead of merely keeping alive what Walt had left behind. She did not think less of those 11 years for it. She simply understood, now, that grief could hold a person steady for exactly as long as it needed to, and no longer than that, and that the sawdust trucks had arrived at almost precisely the moment she was finally ready to let something new take its place. That's the whole of it, and maybe the only lesson worth keeping from it. The road hadn't mocked Faye because they were cruel. They mocked her because a mountain of sawdust looked, from the outside, like exactly what it was supposed to be: waste, a problem, a mess nobody else wanted the trouble of solving. But value doesn't always announce itself in a form anybody recognizes right away. And sometimes the thing everyone else is desperate to get rid of is simply waiting on someone patient enough to ask what it could still become. The road hadn't been wrong that a mountain of sawdust looked, at first, like exactly the burden it appeared to be. They had only been wrong about how long a burden stays a burden once somebody patient enough decides to keep asking what it might still become, one careful, unhurried batch at a time, for as many seasons as the asking actually takes. If you've ever seen worth in something everyone around you had already written off as garbage, tell us where you're listening from, and about the person who first taught you to look twice before throwing something away. The way a grandmother in a cold cellar once taught a 9-year-old, decades before either of them could have guessed how far that lesson would eventually reach. If this story found you today, share it with somebody still finding value in what the world calls waste. Whatever pile of somebody else's problem is sitting at your own fence line tonight, whatever mess the world has already decided to call worthless, may you have the patience to ask what it could still become. And may the harvest, when it finally comes, outlast every doubt that ever stood in its way.